How do Donald Trump and Kamala Harris use storytelling and what we call logical fallacies to persuade audiences to vote for them? In this episode of the Change Your Minds podcast, we're going to unpack the storytelling skills and strategies used by both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump in their efforts to become President of the United States of America. We're going to look at the Democratic Convention speech and the Republican Convention speech, and we're going to unpack both speeches and examine their use of stories and their use of what we call logical fallacies. These are statements that sound logical, but actually aren't logical, in order to be able to persuade so many people to go out and vote for them on November 5th, 2024. This episode is going to peel back the curtain. We're going to dive in, as this is part 2 of a 2-part series. In part 1, we looked at rhetorical techniques that both Harris and Trump used, and we looked at how they position themselves and the opposition in the way in which they communicate. Today, we're going to explore exactly how they do what they do. I really think you're going to get a lot from this episode. So, see you inside. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Change Your Minds podcast. This is Election Special, part 2. In the first election special last week, we talked about the various rhetorical techniques used by both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and we looked at the fact that sometimes they have a bit in common, right? Isn't that nice? We finally find things that we have in common. The other thing we looked at was how they position the other person. And oftentimes they'll position themselves in a certain way, they'll position the enemy or the other person in a different way. And we talked about how they use language to position each other in different ways in the mind of the listener. And so in this particular episode, we're going to walk through the storytelling techniques of both Trump and Harris, and we're also going to look at how they use what we call logical fallacies. These are things that sound logical, but actually it's just a very clever way of using language. It's not that logical at all. And once again, I'm going to try to be as balanced as possible, and the sooner we unpack what they're doing, to me, the more rational and more critical thinkers we can become. So with that in mind, let's talk about the wonderful use of storytelling. So many years ago, I did a master's thesis. I finished the master's thesis in 2003, and it was all about how gurus position themselves in the mind of the audience with regards to using the power of stories. So I would analyze stories told by the gurus and identify the skills used by them. Since then, and that's more than 20 years ago, I've really spent a lot of time studying stories. I've studied screenwriting in UCLA. I've got a professional screenwriting certificate there. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand how stories work. I've delivered trainings on storytelling around the world, from Japan to Colombia. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to understand, how do people tell stories? How do they tell stories in powerful, engaging ways? How do they translate data into stories? And how do they impact people more successfully? And so what I want to do is just offer you some insight as to some of the storytelling strategies and skills that both Harris and Trump use, and specifically what they used in the Democrat convention speech for Harris and the Republican convention speech for Trump in 2024. So let's get started, and let's talk about their use of personal anecdotes. Harris, of course, shares the story of her mother who traveled from India to California and dreamed of being a scientist. The story illustrates the resilience of her mum, the ambition and the immigrant experience, the land of opportunity, all that sort of good stuff. She also shared a story about her best friend Wanda, who confided in her about being sexually abused, which inspired Harris to become a prosecutor to protect others. So again, with specific stories like that tend to be very impactful in the mind of the listener. Trump, on the other hand, talked about a real-life story of the assassination attempt at his rally, describing in detail how a bullet nearly took his life and how the crowd responded in real time. He also tells a story of referencing a conversation with a waitress in Nevada who complained about taxes on her tips, highlighting everyday struggles. This is also, by the way, known as the identifiable victim effect. It's a technique used where, instead of just talking about people, we give a specific example of a waitress or of Wanda, for example, in Harris's case. And by making it specific and real, people are much more likely to see it as a story and feel connected to it and feel almost like they can relate to it. It encourages what we call narrative transportation, which is whenever we get transported into the world of a story, the more specific it is. It's known as the identifiable victim effect. When we can identify the victim in the story, we're more likely to connect with them and feel emotionally that it matters even more as a result. So these personal anecdotes tend to work quite well. Second technique that they both use is they create emotional resonance quite well. So Trump vividly describes blood pouring from his ears during the assassination attempt, evoking concern and sympathy from his audience. He's a great ability to go into detail and make it really dramatic, and it's the blood flowing, which really makes you connect in and you can see it happening in front of you. He also talks about how the crowd didn't want to leave him after the attack, creating a sense of loyalty and emotional unity. Again, they just wanted to stay with me. Again, that kind of complements the crowd, but also talks about the unique relationship he has with the crowd as well. Kamala Harris talks about her mother's struggles and the values she instilled in them. So that story about her mum also emphasizes the values. So it's like, well, we can relate with our own relationship with our own mothers and the importance of the values and looking up to our parents like that. And Harris also described the suffering of women who lost reproductive rights, evoking empathy and concern. She does that through the story, again, of Wanda. So a good understanding there of how both of them create emotional resonance. The next is narrative structure, and this is a little different for both. So Harris's speech tend to follow a clear arc. So very structured. They begin with personal history, move through professional achievements, culminating in the vision for the future. This is what happened. There's the personal, there's the professional, then there's the vision for the future. She then contrasts Trump policies with her future vision, and it's a sense of choice between this future or that future, and it concludes with a call to action. We need to write this next chapter. Whereas Trump structures his narrative more around a moment of danger, an assassination attempt, and builds suspense. He's very, very good at building suspense and building drama. Knows how to do it. I mean, the guy's been reality TV, so he understands how to build suspense and drama. And his speech often revolves around conflicts. Us versus them is a big part of the stories that he tends to tell. He frames his stories as battles with clear winners and losers, and guess which side he's on. Trump tends to conclude his story with messages of triumph, emphasizing how he and his movement would lead America, making America great again. Number 4, and the fourth thing that both would do, would be creating relatable characters and relational storytelling. So Trump frequently references ordinary Americans like the waitress in Nevada, casting them as central figures in his movement. And he also portrays the supporters as patriots in a struggle against elite enemies. Again, this us versus them really makes it so that people can relate to the patriot comment as well. Whereas Harris, she describes her childhood community, including Mrs. Shelton, who became like a second mother, creating a sense of supportive or caring environment. Harris describes also ordinary Americans, workers, small business owners, families, making them the heroes of her story and aligning her vision with their aspirations, which is quite well. And the final thing that both of them tend to do is invoking a vision of the future. So, for instance, Harris outlines a future where the middle class is strong and growing and opportunities available to all. She speaks about a future where reproductive freedom is restored and protected, whereas Trump envisions America being led to new heights of greatness, surpassing any previous or prior achievements, and he promises a future where his movement restores law and order and secures the nation's borders. So based upon their value, based upon what they're angling or what they're going in, Trump tends to be very much about anti-immigration. Kamala tends to be very much about pro-choice in terms of abortion. So those are the issues. But once again, they're painting a vision of the future very clear for their potential audience. The differences in storytelling approach is that Harris tends to emphasize personal values, community, collective vision for the future. She leans into things like inclusivity and unity and shared struggles. We're all together. Whereas Donald Trump tends to use more dramatic, conflict-driven narratives, heroes fighting against adversities, builds on suspense. It's on personal danger and heroism. A great amount of heroism happening in Trump's stories as well. But both are pretty good storytellers, and they have a great ability to be able to capture it and create that experience whereby you're very much affected by it. You find yourself connecting with the characters, you find yourself positioning yourself as the character, and as a result of that, you feel closer to the particular candidate as a result. So there's some of the ways in which they both use storytelling techniques to be effective in their oratory. But let's get into logical fallacies. So a logical fallacies is a statement that sounds logical and can be persuasive as a result of that. It sounds like you're being very logical, but actually upon further inspection, it's actually not logical at all. So it's one of those things that it's like a misdirection. It sounds like it's something really smart, or it sounds like a good idea, or it sounds like you're using logic and reason, but actually you're not really doing that at all. So we're going to talk about a number of different fallacies, and I'm going to give you examples as to how both Harris and Trump use them. And we'll start with the straw man fallacy. And this is the fallacy where you give the worst possible argument of the folks of the other side. So if you're a Republican, you give a very weak version of the Democrat argument. If you're a Democrat, you give a very weak argument of a Republican. And you do that so you can absolutely obliterate it. The subtext of this message is, look how stupid they are. Look how ridiculously weak their argument is. This is opposed to the steelman argument, where you really try to figure out what's the strongest argument that the other person has. But the straw man argument is the easy one to knock over. A good example from Harris here would be, Donald Trump tried to throw away your votes. When he failed, he sent an armed mob to the US Capitol where they assaulted law enforcement officers. So she sort of oversimplifies Trump's role in January 6th to position it very much, this is what he tried to do, this is all that was there. And that's a very weak version of the Republican argument. It would be saying that's all that happened there and it was all on Trump, and it was very simplified. She also says he doesn't actually fight for the middle class. Instead, he fights for himself and his billionaire friends. Again, she kind of positions Trump as just the only reason he's doing this is to support his friends, his billionaire friends, and himself. And that's all that he cares about. And she positions it that way. Whereas Trump says the Democratic Party should immediately stop weaponizing the justice system and labeling their political opponent as an enemy of democracy. So he's pretty much saying that they should stop doing this. The only reason they're doing this is because they're trying to win, and this is dirty tricks. Or if Democrats want to unify our country, they should drop the partisan witch hunts. Again, he frames the actions of the Democrats as just vindictive. That's all that it's about. There's no truth in it. There's nothing to, nothing to see here. That kind of approach there as well. So both of them are examples where they just position, this is why they're doing it. This is why Harris is doing it. This is why Trump's doing it. That's it. It's the only reason, which might be a little bit simplified. The second logical fallacy is what we call a false dilemma. So you're giving people a choice, but it's not really a choice. So we'll give an example from Trump. We will rise together or we'll fall apart. In other words, we'll either vote for me or everything will fall apart. That's a false dilemma. It's not necessarily one or the other. It is possible to rise without necessarily having to rise together with him as president. So he's framing this election as a binary choice between success under his leadership or failure without him. An example from Harris would be, consider not only the chaos and calamity when he was in office, but also the gravity of what's happened since he lost the last election. She's positioning in that you got a choice between chaos and calamity of the last part or stability with her, right? So she's pretty much giving you the choice. Whereas you could argue that it's possible to have stability with Trump and it's possible to have chaos with Harris, right? It's not just a simple choice like it's made out to be. The third technique, or the third logical fallacy, is what we call the slippery slope. And this is really when either candidate positions the other and says, once you start with this, then it's a slippery slope down. So the simple example, normal, we might use would be, as soon as you have some soft drugs, as soon as you smoke weed, automatically that makes you more likely then to start injecting heroin or whatever the case may be. That's like the slippery slope into the habit. And so to give you some examples here, Harris would say, consider his explicit intent to set free violent extremists who assaulted those law enforcement officers at the Capitol, his explicit intent to jail journalists, political opponents, and anyone who's seen as the enemy. She implies that the re-election of Trump would inevitably lead to these authoritarian measures, right? So she says, look, we only got a taste, but look, imagine how bad it will be moving forward. Or another example, she says, is as part of his agenda, he and his allies would limit access to birth control, ban medical abortion, and enact a nationwide abortion ban with or without Congress. So she says, if you vote for him, he'll do this, and then he'll do this, and then it'll be an absolute catastrophe. Whereas Trump, on the other hand, said, if the Democrats continue, we'll see the destruction of our country, right? That's a nice, simple way. No being around the bush there. So if the Democrats continue, if we keep them in the power, it's a slippery slope to the destruction of our country. And then we will not let these killers and criminals into our country. I want to keep our sons and daughters safe. So again, continuous Democrat control will directly lead to killers and criminals coming into the country. It's a slippery slope down. The number 4 logical fallacy is a very popular one. This is something used a lot by both candidates, and it's something that Trump pretty much specializes in, but Harris has used it a lot on Trump as well. It's called ad hominem. It's insulting a person's character. In a nutshell, it's like the opposite to ethos. And so an example from Trump is when he says, crazy Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats are destroying our country, for example. Using crazy and nicknames, everything. It was Sleepy Joe Biden, I think, as well. And And Harris uses her own. She goes, Donald Trump is an unserious man, but the consequences of putting Donald Trump back in the White House are extremely serious. So calling him unserious instead of focusing on his policy or actions really is a personal attack that she uses. And like there's tons more from both candidates, even in the recent debate that was done as well. The next technique or logical fallacy used is what they call appeal to fear. And an example here would be from Harris's perspective. She says, just imagine Donald Trump with no guardrails, I used that example before, and how he would use the immense powers of the presidency of the United States. Just imagine this guy is the boogeyman, he's the worst in the world. And Trump, from his side, says, our planet is teetering on the edge of World War III. And once again, subtext is, that's because of the Democrats. So again, both of them are saying, if you don't vote for me, be scared. Because if Donald Trump gets into power, be scared. He's got no guardrails. If Kamala Harris gets into power, be scared because she's not going to be able to stop World War III. Okay. Number 6 is a hasty generalization. This is something that, once again, both candidates use quite a bit. Donald Trump, a good example, would be, he says the Democrats are corrupt and out to destroy democracy, and the entire media is fake news. So he paints the Democrats or the media in one brush and sort of positions them, this is what they're like, all of them, straight away, and no specificity whatsoever. And Harris says Trump, on the other hand, and this is when she's talking, threatened to abandon NATO, encouraged Putin to invade our allies. She makes a generalization about what he does. She said Donald Trump handpicked members of the US Supreme Court to take away reproductive freedom. Once again, a big generalization, as if that's exactly the only thing that he was trying to do with regards to what he did. The next technique, I just have an example by Harris, and then I'll give you an example of another technique by Trump. But another example of Harris is guilt by association. She talks about how Trump plans to create a national anti-abortion coordinator and force states to report on women's miscarriages and abortions. Simply put, they're out of their minds. So she associates Trump with the most extreme view of abortions, and as a result tries to make him guilty by association to those places. Whereas another logical fallacy, appeal to tradition, is something that Trump uses. He talks about restoring peace, stability, and harmony all throughout the world as we had before, painting it as this idyllic past experience. We had the greatest economy in history. We need to go back to that. And once again, he's appealing to tradition. We need to go back to where we were before. This is where everything is great. And so if you see it, there's a number of differences in terms of the way in which both presidential candidates use logical fallacies to try to position themselves in the most persuasive way. Harris's fallacies often are around fear of what will happen with Trump and character attacks, whereas she likes to portray Trump as a dangerous, corrupt, and unfit for a leadership candidate. She uses straw man and slippery slope fallacies to create an exaggerated version of Trump's potential action, while Trump's fallacies frequently focus on false dilemmas and hasty generalizations. He sort of simplifies complex issues into binary choices, makes sweeping statements, uses appeal to fear and character attacks to rally his base by portraying the opposition to existential threats. Tomorrow, millions of people across America will be going to the ballot to vote for the president in 2024. Let me say this, I have political views. I have a certain point of view as to who I think would make the best candidate, and I'm going to tell you now, nothing at all. I'm not going to tell you anything because that's not what I do. But I just want you to know that because I think sometimes it can be very easy because I'm pointing holes in both sides to go, oh, Owen's being very careful, he's being very safe. And I think a lot of times, and this is something I want to speak to, a lot of times you fall into this trap of thinking just because a person tells you what their political view is or their view about something going on in the world, that makes them courageous. Well, to a degree, maybe it makes them courageous because they know that they're going to get some hate or they're going to get some pushback as a result of that. But just because they do that doesn't necessarily make them courageous because equally they'll also have a lot of people that are on their side as a result. So picking sides or picking choices is well and good, but from my point of view, and this is just my philosophy on it, I don't believe in positioning my views because my views in terms of what I believe should happen in the election or who I believe should win in the election, really they're just my views. I'm not an expert on politics. I'm not an expert in foreign policy. I'm not an expert on the economy. I'm not an expert in immigration. I'm not an expert on all of these different topics. But what I am an expert in is how people persuade others, how people influence others. And that's really what I wanted to focus on today. And the problem is, in this day and age, as soon as I turn around and say I'm on this side of this issue, automatically everyone will then only listen to me if I'm on the same side as them. And really, I believe one of the things we need to do is we need to start to work at becoming less polarized. And this means we need to be more curious about the other side and try to understand different points of view. So while I have my own point of view and perspective, I also respect the fact that other people have a very different way of thinking than I do. And that doesn't necessarily make them wrong. It doesn't necessarily make them bad. It doesn't necessarily make them evil. It just means that they have a different story that they're telling themselves about what should happen, about how the world should be. So for me, I really want to be someone who helps you to understand why we tell the stories to ourselves that we do, so that you can start to tell more empowering stories and you can start to use more empowering stories to communicate your message. Who am I voting for? It doesn't matter. What matters is if you're an American citizen, if you can, go out and vote for whoever you think is the best candidate. But realize that we're being influenced and persuaded by so many people, by the media, by social media, by the different influencers, by the people on both sides, by the candidates themselves. And I hope in this episode and the last episode, part 1, you learned a number of different strategies and techniques and ways in which both candidates are deliberately using rhetoric and oratory techniques to be able to influence and persuade you to vote for them. Hope you found this useful. If you did, please share it. Let more people know. Best of luck with everything. If you're looking for any more information about some of the things I do, go to changeofminds.com where you'll learn more about the memberships available there. And also, please do visit me on LinkedIn, say hello, put a comment under this video if you're watching it. And if you're listening to it, rate and review. That would be amazing. But for now, take care, be well. May the force always be with you. Good luck, and may your candidate, whoever that is, win. And if they don't win, may you still be okay. Bye for now.